Detective Marcus Hale had always believed that a man with a badge was untouchable. To him, the small silver shield pinned to his chest was more than metal. It was power. It was protection. And in many ways, it was the only identity he had left. From the outside, Marcus looked like the perfect officer. Tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp eyes that never seemed to soften, he carried himself with confidence. His footsteps were heavy, his voice calm but firm, and when he entered a room, people noticed. Colleagues at the station admired his bravery. Young recruits watched him with respect. And citizens, whether guilty or innocent, lowered their gaze when he approached. He wore the badge like a crown. To Marcus, it meant control. It meant that rules bent around him, not the other way. If he decided someone was guilty, then in his mind, they were guilty. If he bent the law a little, he told himself it was for the greater good. And if anyone questioned him, he reminded them who carried the authority. At night, when he walked the streets of the city, he felt the badge glowing under the streetlights. It gave him courage, but also arrogance. When strangers crossed paths with him, they often stepped aside quickly. No one dared to challenge the man whose reputation was whispered through alleys and cafes. But Marcus's confidence was not only built on the badge. It was built on years of pushing boundaries, testing how far he could go before anyone would stop him. And the truth was, no one ever had. Every time he stretched the rules, every time he forced his way through an investigation, he walked away clean. The system protected him because the system believed it needed men like him, tough, fearless, and unwilling to back down. The city itself seemed to echo his pride. It was a place of tall glass buildings, crowded streets, and neon signs that never slept. Crime lived in its corners, hidden in shadows, but Marcus always acted as though he stood above it all. He thought of himself as a hunter walking among sheep. In courtrooms, Marcus was a familiar figure. He stood tall beside lawyers, watching defendants tremble as their cases unfolded. He rarely doubted the outcome, because his word carried weight. Judges trusted his reports. Juries respected his testimony. To many, he was the face of justice. To Marcus, he was the law itself. Yet behind this image, there was something darker growing, a quiet arrogance, a belief that he could never be wrong. He had begun to mistake fear for respect. He thought silence meant approval, when in truth, many stayed silent simply because they felt powerless against him. At home, Marcus rarely thought about the choices he made. His apartment was neat, but cold, with no photographs on the walls, no signs of family or warmth. He lived alone, and in some ways, he preferred it. The badge filled the emptiness. It gave him purpose. It told him who he was when no one else was around. Sometimes, late at night, he would sit by the window and look out at the city lights. He would remember his younger days, the eager rookie who believed the badge was a promise of honor. But those memories felt distant, almost like they belonged to someone else. Over time, the honor had been replaced with pride, and the pride had become a shield so thick that nothing seemed able to break it. His colleagues never questioned him, at least not openly. Some admired him too much, while others feared what might happen if they stood in his way. A few whispered about his methods, about the shortcuts he took or the pressure he used on suspects, but those whispers never reached Marcus. Or if they did, he ignored them. To him, results mattered more than methods. On the surface, Marcus's life looked like success. He had a respected career, the trust of the court, and the admiration of his peers. But beneath it all, cracks had already begun to form. Every decision he made, every time he pushed someone down to lift himself higher, left behind small pieces of resentment in the world around him. He could not see it yet, but the silence of those he intimidated was not endless. The fear he inspired would not protect him forever. Somewhere in the city, someone was waiting, someone strong enough, clever enough, and determined enough to stand against him. But on this particular night, Marcus felt none of that coming. He leaned back in his chair, his badge resting heavy on his chest, and smiled to himself. In his mind, he was untouchable. The badge was his iron shield, and as long as he wore it, no one could harm him. Or so he believed. The courthouse was always a place Marcus Hale enjoyed. To him, it was not only a house of law but also a stage where he performed with confidence. The high walls, the long wooden benches, the smell of polished floors, it all reminded him that he was a man of power. Every case he walked into felt like a battle he was certain to win. On one rainy morning, as gray clouds pressed over the city, Marcus entered the courtroom with his usual pride. He was calm, his badge shining against his dark suit. His eyes swept the room, and he noticed the woman standing at the defense table. She looked different from the people he usually faced. Her name was Elena Marrow. Elena was not loud. She did not look frightened or desperate, like others who found themselves standing before the court. She was dressed simply in a gray coat, her dark hair tied back neatly, and her hands folded calmly on the table. There was something steady about her presence. When she lifted her eyes and met Marcus's, he felt no fear in them. For the first time in a long while, Marcus hesitated. It was not because he doubted himself, but because her gaze was sharp, as though she could see through him. Still, he shook off the feeling. To him, she was just another case. Another name on his long list of people to bring down. The judge called the room to order, and the trial began. Marcus listened as the charges against Elena were read. She was accused of fraud, stealing money through clever tricks and false documents. Marcus had pushed hard for this case. To him, Elena was dangerous because she was intelligent. People like her made him uneasy, and he believed putting her away would prove his strength once more. But as the lawyers spoke, Elena sat quietly. She did not interrupt. She did not protest. She simply watched, her calm eyes moving from the judge to Marcus, then back again. Every now and then, she wrote something in a small notebook, her hands steady, her face thoughtful. Others in the courtroom whispered about her. Some said she had connections, that she came from a family with influence. Others believed she was clever enough to defend herself without fear. Marcus heard the whispers, but he ignored them. In his mind, no one could resist him in court. His testimony alone carried enough weight to bury any defense. Still, something about Elena unsettled him. When the judge asked her to speak, she stood slowly, her voice soft but clear. She did not waste time denying the charges directly. Instead, she asked questions. She spoke carefully, drawing attention to small details in the case, details Marcus had never expected her to notice. She pointed out mistakes in the paperwork, gaps in the evidence, and inconsistencies in the timeline. Her tone was not angry but calm, almost patient, as if she were guiding the court to see what she already knew. Marcus felt the shift in the room. The jury leaned forward. Even the judge paused, listening closely. It was not common for defendants to speak with such control, especially without trembling. Marcus clenched his jaw. He reminded himself that this was only the beginning. People often tried to appear strong at first, but eventually, they broke. He believed Elena would break too. Yet, as the day went on, her calmness never left. During breaks, she sat alone, writing in her notebook. She did not ask for sympathy, nor did she act defeated. It was as if she had entered the courtroom not to defend herself, but to test something or someone. By the end of the first session, Marcus found himself thinking about her more than he wanted to. Usually, once he left the courthouse, his mind was clear. He would go back to the station, write his reports, and move on to the next case. But Elena's eyes stayed with him. He replayed the way she looked at him, direct, unshaken. It was not the look of someone afraid of losing. It was the look of someone waiting. That night, Marcus sat in his apartment, staring at the city lights outside his window. He poured himself a glass of water, but his hand was tense. Why was he bothered? He had faced stronger criminals before, men with weapons, gangs with numbers, families with wealth. None of them had made him feel this way. Elena was different. She had no loud words, no threats, no display of anger. Her power came from silence and patience, and that was something Marcus had never learned how to fight. Still, he told himself it didn't matter. The case was strong. The evidence was there. And his badge, as always, would carry weight in the courtroom. He believed it was only a matter of time before Elena would fall, just like all the others. But deep inside, a question had begun to whisper in his mind: what if she knows something I don't? It was a thought Marcus quickly pushed away. He would not allow doubt to weaken him. He was Detective Marcus Hale, and he was untouchable. Or so he believed. The next week of the trial began with heavy air in the courtroom. People filled the benches, curious about the strange case of Elena Marrow. Some came because they respected Marcus Hale, the detective known for his fearlessness. Others came because of Elena, the quiet woman who stood tall against him without flinching. Marcus entered the room as he always did, shoulders straight, face hard, badge gleaming. He told himself he was in control, that nothing could shake him. Yet, as his eyes landed on Elena sitting at the defense table, he felt that same uneasy stir in his chest. She sat calmly, her notebook open, her pen resting between her fingers. When she noticed him, she lifted her gaze slowly. Her eyes met his, steady and unafraid, and once again he felt as though she could see through him. The lawyers began their arguments, calling witnesses, presenting papers, and reading reports. Marcus gave his testimony with confidence, explaining how the investigation had led to Elena. He spoke about the evidence he had gathered, his voice firm, his words sharp. The jury listened carefully, nodding at times. It was the same rhythm Marcus had lived many times before. He was the hero, the man who brought criminals to light. But then Elena rose. She didn't shout or argue. Instead, she asked questions that reached deeper than Marcus expected. She asked about the chain of custody of the documents. She asked why certain witnesses were interviewed but others ignored. She even asked about Marcus himself, where he was during certain nights, why his reports skipped details, and how he came to certain conclusions without proof. Each question was polite, her tone almost gentle, but the effect was sharp. The courtroom grew quiet, listening closely. Marcus felt heat rise in his chest. He had been in many trials, but rarely had the accused spoken so boldly. The judge allowed her to continue, and Elena used her time well. She pointed out small mistakes in the files, dates that didn't match, signatures that looked rushed, statements that sounded copied. They were not enough to dismiss the case, but they were enough to plant a seed of doubt. And that was what unsettled Marcus most. When the court broke for recess, Marcus walked outside into the corridor. His jaw was tight, and he paced slowly. Reporters stood nearby, whispering and writing notes. He overheard one of them say, "That woman knows too much. She speaks like she's the one investigating." Marcus clenched his fist. That was exactly how it felt. Later that day, as Elena sat quietly waiting for the session to resume, Marcus found his eyes drawn to her notebook. He couldn't see the words, but he could see how many pages were filled. Lines, arrows, small sketches of connections she had been studying, preparing, perhaps even watching him long before this trial began. It made him restless. That night, back in his apartment, Marcus couldn't relax. The city lights outside seemed brighter, almost mocking him. He poured himself a drink and sat at his table, opening the files of the case again. He told himself he was looking for errors she might try to use against him, but the truth was, he was searching for proof that she was wrong. Hours passed. The more he read, the more uncomfortable he became. There were gaps, small ones he had ignored before, but now they stood out like cracks in a wall. Why hadn't he filled them properly? Why had he rushed the paperwork, thinking no one would notice? He remembered how Elena had looked at him, calm and certain, and he felt something unusual: fear. Not fear of losing the case, but fear of exposure. Because what if Elena knew more than she showed? What if she had evidence, not only about her innocence but about him? The thought followed him into his sleep. His dreams were broken and restless, filled with flashes of the courtroom, the sound of Elena's voice, the steady way she asked her questions. The next morning, Marcus walked into the courthouse with his usual strong steps, but inside, his heart carried weight. He watched Elena carefully, noticing how she whispered something to her lawyer, how she turned pages of her notebook with slow precision. When she spoke again, her words carried a new edge. She hinted that some of the evidence against her might have been influenced or even created by someone with authority. She never said Marcus's name, but her eyes flicked toward him, and everyone noticed. A wave of whispers ran through the courtroom. The judge called for silence, but the moment had already left its mark. Marcus forced himself to stay calm, his face hard, his shoulders still broad. But inside, the shield of his badge no longer felt so solid. The courtroom was no longer his stage. It was becoming hers. And though he did not admit it aloud, Marcus knew, Elena Marrow was not just defending herself. She was pulling threads, one by one, and each thread led back to him. For the first time in years, Marcus felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He had brought many people into court before, certain of their defeat. But this time was different. This time, it was not only Elena's life on trial. It was his own reputation, his own choices, his own untouchable image. And Elena was determined to unravel it all. Marcus Hale had always been a man of certainty. In his world, there was no room for hesitation. He was the detective who spoke with authority, who entered a room and silenced doubts with the weight of his badge. But now, as the trial continued, that certainty began to slip away. The courtroom no longer felt like his domain. Instead, it felt like a place where every word he spoke was being measured, every glance judged, every step watched. And the one watching most closely was Elena Marrow. She sat at the defense table with the same calm she had shown since the first day. Her notebook was never far from her hand, her pen moving across the pages whenever someone spoke. She rarely showed emotion, but her silence was louder than any outburst. When Marcus spoke, she listened. When the lawyers argued, she observed. And when she rose to question, the room leaned toward her as though drawn by some quiet force. For Marcus, it was maddening. On the third day of the week, he took the witness stand again. He told his version of events, his voice strong and steady. He spoke of how he discovered the supposed fraud, how the evidence pointed directly to Elena. He used the same firm language he always had, the language that once made juries nod without doubt. But Elena was ready. When her lawyer gave her the floor, she stood and approached slowly, her notebook in hand. Her first question was simple: "Detective Hale, can you explain why your report on the financial records skips the month of April?" The courtroom grew quiet. Marcus blinked, surprised. He had written that report quickly, certain no one would notice the missing month. He cleared his throat and gave a vague answer about incomplete data. Elena nodded politely, then asked her next question. And the next. And the next. Each one sharper, each one pressing into the cracks he thought were hidden. She asked why some witnesses were never contacted, why certain documents were copied but the originals never shown, why his timeline of events conflicted with bank statements. Marcus answered as best he could, his tone still firm, but inside he felt his control slipping. He could see the jury exchanging glances. He could hear the faint scratch of pens as they took notes. Even the judge leaned forward slightly, watching him with more care than before. By the end of her questioning, Marcus felt sweat at the back of his neck. He left the stand with his shoulders still straight, but his steps were heavier. That night, back in his apartment, the silence was unbearable. He tried to distract himself by reviewing old cases, but his mind kept returning to Elena's questions. How had she found those details? Why had she studied his work so carefully? He poured himself a glass of water and stared at the city skyline. For the first time in years, he admitted to himself that he was nervous. Not about the case, but about her. She was different from anyone he had faced. She was not fighting with rage or desperation, she was fighting with patience, and patience was far more dangerous. As the days passed, Marcus's unease grew. Small mistakes began to haunt him. A missing date here, an overlooked file there. Things he once brushed aside now looked like shadows crawling across his past. And Elena seemed to know exactly where those shadows were. At the station, some of his colleagues noticed the change in him. "You all right, Hale?" one asked. Marcus forced a laugh and said he was fine, but his sharp tone made it clear he did not want more questions. The truth was, he wasn't fine. The cracks in his armor were widening, and no amount of confidence could cover them. In court, Elena continued her quiet war. Every session, she revealed a little more, just enough to keep the jury uncertain, just enough to keep Marcus on edge. She spoke of documents that were missing, witnesses who might still come forward, and connections that hinted at something larger than fraud. Marcus tried to fight back, to regain control. He raised his voice, emphasized his authority, and reminded the court of his years of service. But the harder he pushed, the more it seemed like he was defending himself instead of the case. Late one evening, after another long day in court, Marcus sat in his car outside the courthouse. The rain tapped softly against the windshield, and he rested his head against the steering wheel. He thought about how far he had come in his career, how untouchable he once felt. And now, he felt the badge on his chest like a heavy stone, dragging him down instead of lifting him. He remembered Elena's eyes, calm, unwavering. She was not afraid of him. That thought alone was enough to shake him. Because if she wasn't afraid, then she must have something stronger than fear. She must have truth. And Marcus knew, deep inside, that truth was the one weapon his badge could not protect him from. As he drove home that night, the city lights blurred in the rain. He told himself he still had control, that he could still win. But the words felt hollow. For the first time in his career, Marcus Hale felt like the hunter who had become the prey. The cracks in his armor were no longer invisible. They were spreading, and soon, everyone would see them. The courtroom was filled with a different kind of energy now. What had once been Marcus Hale's stage was slowly becoming Elena Marrow's ground. Every day, her calm words and sharp questions left their mark. The jury no longer looked only at Marcus with respect, they now turned their attention to her, curious and cautious. Marcus felt the shift but refused to admit it. He told himself that he was still in control, that the badge on his chest still carried weight. Yet deep inside, he knew the balance of power was changing. Elena was no longer on trial in the way she had been at the beginning. Somehow, she had made the trial about him. On the fifth morning of the hearings, Elena arrived with a quiet determination. Her lawyer carried a thick folder, heavier than the papers they had shown before. Marcus noticed it immediately. His chest tightened, though he kept his expression calm. The judge called the court to order, and the proceedings began. The prosecutor presented more evidence against Elena, speaking loudly, trying to remind everyone of the original charges. But when Elena stood, the room seemed to lean toward her again. She opened the folder slowly and pulled out several documents. Her lawyer handed copies to the judge, the jury, and the prosecutor. Marcus watched closely, his jaw tight. "These are communications," Elena said, her voice steady, between members of the financial department and certain officials in the police force. The courtroom stirred. The judge raised an eyebrow and asked her to continue. "These letters," she went on, "do not show my guilt. They show pressure. They show manipulation. And more importantly, they show how some reports were adjusted, not to reflect the truth, but to serve a purpose." Her words were calm, but their weight dropped like stones. Marcus felt heat rising in his chest. He knew what was coming, even before she turned her gaze toward him. "Detective Hale," Elena said suddenly, her voice still polite, "you wrote one of these reports, did you not?" The judge looked at Marcus. The jury turned their eyes toward him. For a moment, he could not move. "Yes," he said finally, his voice low. "That is my report." Elena nodded. "Then perhaps you can explain why the numbers in this report differ from the original bank records, which I have also submitted to the court." Gasps rippled through the room. The prosecutor objected, but the judge allowed the documents to be reviewed. The comparison was clear. Marcus's report showed figures that strengthened the case against Elena. But the original records, untouched and verified, told a different story. Marcus tried to defend himself. He said the records must have been incomplete when he reviewed them. He said mistakes happen in investigations. He said he had acted in good faith. But his words did not sound as strong as they once did. They sounded like excuses. Elena listened quietly, then added another piece to her trap. She presented recorded statements from two minor witnesses, statements Marcus had dismissed early in the investigation. The recordings revealed details that supported her version, not his. The judge listened carefully. The jury scribbled furiously on their notepads. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. The walls were closing in. For years, Marcus had walked through courtrooms certain of his control. But now, with each document, each word from Elena, the walls of his shield cracked further. He felt exposed in a way he had never known. When the session ended for the day, Marcus walked quickly out of the courthouse. Cameras flashed as reporters shouted questions. "Detective Hale, do you have a response to the new evidence? Detective Hale, did you alter reports? Detective Hale, are you still confident about this case?" He ignored them, his face hard, his steps fast. But inside, he was shaken. That night, in his apartment, he could not sit still. He paced from one end of the room to the other, his thoughts spinning. He had always believed the badge protected him. That as long as he wore it, people would trust his word. But Elena had broken that illusion in front of everyone. She had set a trap, and he had walked straight into it. Her calmness now made sense. She had been preparing, gathering, waiting. She had studied him, studied his reports, studied the system he thought he controlled. And now, she was pulling it apart piece by piece. Marcus sat down heavily, his head in his hands. He told himself there was still time to fight, still a chance to regain control. But the truth pressed harder than ever. Elena had not come to court simply to defend herself. She had come to reveal something greater, to reveal him. The badge on his chest, once so bright, now felt like a weight dragging him down. The iron shield he had trusted for so long was no longer protecting him. It was exposing him. And deep inside, Marcus knew, the worst was still to come. The courtroom was silent when Marcus Hale walked in the next morning. It was not the silence of respect, nor the silence of fear. It was a silence filled with questions. Reporters sat ready with their pens, the jury looked restless, and even the judge carried a sharper gaze than before. Marcus felt the difference immediately. For years, he had walked into rooms where people trusted him without doubt. But now, every pair of eyes followed him with suspicion. His badge, once a symbol of authority, no longer shone with power. Instead, it seemed to weigh heavily against his chest, as if reminding him of the truth he had tried to ignore. Elena Marrow sat at her table as calm as ever. Her notebook was open, her pen resting lightly on the page. When Marcus's eyes met hers, she did not smile, nor did she frown. She simply looked at him as though everything was already decided. The judge called the session to order. The prosecutor, who had once spoken with confidence, now seemed cautious. He repeated his arguments against Elena, raising his voice, trying to convince the jury that her so-called evidence was only confusion. But his words fell flat. The jury had seen too much already. Then it was Elena's turn. She stood slowly, the folder of documents in her hand. This time, her voice carried more weight. It was not only calm, it was certain. She presented more records, more statements, each one connecting like links in a chain. She showed how Marcus's reports were not only careless but shaped to push the blame on her. The room grew tense as she laid the papers before the judge. Side by side, the differences were undeniable. On one side, Marcus's reports. On the other, the original evidence. Numbers altered. Dates changed. Witness names missing. The prosecutor objected, but the judge silenced him with a wave of the hand. "Detective Hale," the judge said, his voice firm, "do you have an explanation for these contradictions?" Marcus felt the air leave his chest. His throat tightened. He had faced criminals with weapons, dangerous men in dark alleys, but never had he felt fear like this, fear of words, fear of truth. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Every excuse he thought of sounded weak before it left his tongue. He finally muttered something about mistakes, about pressure, about the difficulty of large investigations. But no one looked convinced. Elena then revealed the final piece. A letter. "This," she said, holding it up, "was written by a clerk who worked under Detective Hale. The clerk no longer works with the department, but he kept a copy of what he signed. It shows that parts of the case were adjusted on direct instruction. And the signature here," she placed the page on the judge's desk, "belongs to Detective Marcus Hale." The courtroom gasped. Reporters scribbled frantically. The jury's eyes widened. Marcus's face burned. He wanted to deny it, but the paper was there, clear as day. His own handwriting. His own mark. The judge's eyes hardened. "Detective Hale, is this your signature?" Silence filled the room. Marcus's mouth felt dry. Finally, he nodded. "Yes." The word fell heavy in the air. For years, Marcus had believed he was untouchable. That his badge placed him above the questions of ordinary people. But in that moment, standing under the gaze of the court, he felt smaller than he ever had before. Elena closed her folder slowly. She had not raised her voice, she had not shouted, but she had done what no one else had dared. She had broken the image of Marcus Hale. The judge leaned back in his chair. This court will need to review not only the charges against the defendant but also the actions of the lead detective in this case. Until then, all evidence provided by Detective Hale will be questioned. The words struck like a hammer. Marcus's body felt heavy. The courtroom was no longer his stage. It was his trial now, even if his name was not officially written on the file. He sat down slowly, avoiding the stares of the jury, avoiding the flashing eyes of the reporters, avoiding Elena's steady gaze. When the session ended, he left the courthouse through the back door. Cameras still caught him, shouting questions, snapping photos. "Detective Hale, did you lie? Detective Hale, are you under investigation? Detective Hale, what happens next?" He kept walking, his steps uneven, his head lowered. For the first time, he could not use his badge to silence them. That night, Marcus sat alone in his apartment. The silence was crushing. His badge lay on the table before him, no longer pinned proudly to his chest. He stared at it for a long time. It was scratched, worn from years of use. Once it had felt like honor. Later, it had felt like power. Now, it felt like a reminder of his downfall. He thought of the courtroom, of Elena's calm voice, of the papers spread out for all to see. He thought of the jury's eyes, no longer full of respect, but doubt. He thought of the word he had spoken yes and how it had shattered everything he had built. Marcus Hale had fallen. And there was no shield left to protect him. The final day of the trial arrived with a heavy stillness. The courthouse, once buzzing with confidence whenever Marcus Hale appeared, now carried a quiet tension. Reporters filled the benches, ready to record the fall of the detective who had once seemed untouchable. Citizens came too, curious to see how the case would end. Marcus walked in slowly, his steps lacking the sharpness they once carried. His shoulders sagged slightly, his face pale. The badge was still pinned to his chest, but it no longer shone. To him, it felt like a weight, dragging him lower with every breath. Across the room, Elena Marrow sat in her usual calm. Her notebook rested on the table, but she barely touched it now. Her work was done. She had said what needed to be said, and she had revealed what needed to be revealed. She no longer had to fight because the truth was already out in the open. The judge entered, and the court rose. The final statements began. The prosecutor tried one last time to argue that Elena was guilty of fraud. His words were firm, but his voice lacked power. The evidence against her had been broken apart piece by piece, and everyone in the room knew it. Then Elena's lawyer stood. He spoke clearly, reminding the court of everything that had been revealed, the altered reports, the missing witnesses, the documents that told a different story from Marcus's words. He pointed out that this was not only about Elena's innocence, but about the trust people placed in those who wore the badge. Finally, the judge turned to the jury. After hours of waiting, the verdict was read. Elena Marrow is found not guilty. The words echoed through the courtroom. Elena closed her notebook and placed her pen neatly on top. She did not smile or celebrate. She simply lowered her eyes for a moment, breathing slowly, as though carrying the weight of a long journey finally completed. But the judge was not finished. He turned his gaze toward Marcus. "Detective Hale," he said firmly, "this court recommends a full investigation into your conduct, your reports, and your previous cases. Until further notice, your testimony will not be trusted without review. You will be suspended from duty." The room gasped. Reporters scribbled faster than ever. Cameras flashed. Marcus felt the words strike harder than any bullet could. Suspended. His career, his reputation, his pride suspended, just like that. He lowered his head, unable to meet anyone's eyes. When the session ended, Marcus remained seated for a moment. The badge on his chest burned against his skin. Slowly, he unpinned it and held it in his hand. It felt heavier than ever before, as though all the years of arrogance, shortcuts, and pride were trapped inside it. He looked across the room. Elena was standing now, gathering her things. For a brief second, their eyes met. She did not gloat. She did not smile. She only gave him a steady, quiet look, a look that said everything. It was not revenge. It was balance. Marcus left the courthouse through the side door, away from the cameras. The rain had started again, soft drops falling against the pavement. He walked with slow steps, his badge still clutched in his hand. The city that once felt like his kingdom now looked different, colder, sharper, no longer bending to his presence. At home, his apartment felt emptier than ever. He placed the badge on the table and sat in silence. Memories flooded him, the younger version of himself, eager and hopeful, believing the badge was a promise of justice. Then the later years, when pride took over, when he thought no one could stop him. And finally, the courtroom, where all his confidence had crumbled. For the first time in his life, Marcus admitted the truth to himself. The badge had never made him untouchable. It had only given him the illusion of power. Real power had always belonged to truth, and truth had found its way to him through Elena. Days turned into weeks. Investigators began reviewing his past cases. Reporters filled newspapers with his story, calling it the fall of the untouchable. Some people spoke of him with anger, others with disappointment. But for Marcus, the loudest voice was the silence in his apartment. He often sat by the window, watching the city lights. They no longer looked like symbols of power. Instead, they looked like reminders of all the choices he had made, of the people he had silenced, of the arrogance that had brought him down. One evening, he walked to the table where the badge still rested. He picked it up, feeling its cold surface. He thought of the honor it once represented, and how far he had drifted from that meaning. Slowly, he placed it back down, this time not as a symbol of pride, but as a reminder of what he had lost. Meanwhile, Elena continued with her life quietly. She did not seek the spotlight, though it followed her for a while. People admired her strength, her patience, her ability to face power without fear. But she remained calm, never boasting. For her, victory was not about bringing Marcus down, it was about proving that truth could stand against arrogance. And so, the story of Marcus Hale ended not with the sound of applause or the flash of triumph, but with silence. A silence filled with lessons. He had thought his badge made him untouchable. But in the end, it was the truth, carried by the quiet strength of the wrong woman he brought to court, that broke him.